You think you know The Ugly Duckling, that beloved children's tale about an awkward bird who transforms into a beautiful swan, teaching generations about inner beauty and the pain of being different. But the tale you've been told is a lie. The story that mothers read to children at bedtime wasn't meant to comfort the outcasts of society. It was designed as a psychological weapon, a coded confession wrapped in feathers and innocence, hiding one of the most disturbing chapters in Hans Christian Andersen's life, a chapter that the literary establishment has deliberately obscured for nearly 2 centuries. When you uncover the true origins of The Ugly Duckling, you will never see childhood innocence the same way again. The story's dark genesis reveals something far more disturbing than a simple fairy tale. It exposes the wounds of a broken man whose personal horrors became cultural touchstones that we still celebrate today. The familiar version tells us of a misfit bird, mocked and rejected for his appearance until nature reveals his true identity as a magnificent swan. A heartwarming metamorphosis. But this sanitized narrative carefully strips away the disturbing psychological reality that Andersen embedded in his original work, a reality that contemporary Danish readers would have recognized instantly. The real story wasn't about transformation, it was about mutilation. Picture Copenhagen in the bitter winter of 1842. Hans Christian Andersen sits alone in his sparse apartment on Nyhavn Street, the candlelight casting long shadows across his gaunt face. He is 37 years old, but his eyes carry the haunted look of a man who has witnessed horrors beyond his years. The city outside is blanketed in snow, but the true cold dwells within Andersen himself. He takes up his pen and begins to write not a children's story, but a psychological exorcism. Andersen scholars have long acknowledged the autobiographical elements in The Ugly Duckling. The standard interpretation suggests that Andersen, who grew up poor and awkward before achieving literary fame, was simply creating a metaphor for his own life's trajectory. But this convenient reading ignores crucial historical evidence and the disturbing personal diaries that Andersen kept, diaries that were purposefully mistranslated and selectively edited in their first English publications. The original Danish manuscript of Den Grimme Ælling contains passages that never made it to publication, passages discovered in 1967 by Danish literary historian Magnus Eriksson in the Royal Danish Archives, but quickly suppressed by the Andersen Literary Society. These excised sections describe the duckling's fantasies of self-mutilation, of tearing out his own feathers until blood ran down his gray body, of drowning himself in the very pond where his tormentors swam. The original ending didn't feature a natural transformation into a swan. It depicted a violent, self-inflicted metamorphosis. But the horror doesn't stop there. To understand the true darkness of The Ugly Duckling, we must examine the precise timing of its creation. The tale wasn't written, as most bibliographies claim, throughout 1843. Andersen's personal correspondence with his patron Edvard Collin reveals that the entire story was composed during a fevered 3-day period in December 1842, immediately following Andersen's devastating rejection by the Swedish soprano Jenny Lind. Andersen had become obsessed with Lind, whom he met during her Copenhagen performance of Norma in September of that year. His diaries describe her as a creature of another world. He pursued her relentlessly, writing her passionate letters that she politely deflected. On December 7, 1842, Lind finally sent Andersen the letter that would break him, a letter the content of which has been deliberately mischaracterized by Andersen biographers for centuries. The actual letter, preserved in the Copenhagen Museum archives, doesn't merely decline Andersen's romantic overtures, it specifically references his physical appearance in the cruelest terms. Your unusual height and features, so often commented upon by others, make it impossible for me to think of you as more than a curiosity of nature. The letter continues with a passage that would later be directly echoed in the farmyard scenes of The Ugly Duckling. Like the strange bird that cannot find its place among the common poultry, you too must accept your station. 3 days after receiving this letter, Andersen began writing his children's tale, but his original draft wasn't meant for children at all. The darkness of Andersen's personal life permeates the original text in ways that modern translations have systematically erased. Consider the Danish word vanskapt that Andersen repeatedly uses to describe the duckling. Modern translations render this simply as ugly, but a more accurate translation would be deformed or malformed, the same word used in 19th century Danish medical texts to describe birth defects and physical abnormalities. Andersen's obsession with physical deformity wasn't merely literary. His personal diaries reveal a man tormented by his own appearance, standing at 6 feet 4 inches in an era when the average Danish man was 5 feet 7 inches, with a narrow face, unusually large nose, tiny eyes, and enormous feet. Andersen was described by his contemporaries in terms that mirror the duckling's treatment. Baron von Guldenkron famously referred to him as a strange specimen that God created on one of his experimental days. But perhaps the most devastating detail comes from Andersen's private papers, discovered in a hidden compartment of his writing desk in 1926 and quickly sealed by the Danish government until 1975. These papers include sketches of surgical procedures that Andersen contemplated undergoing, primitive cosmetic surgeries to reduce the size of his nose, alter the shape of his face, and even reduce his height through a dangerous procedure involving the breaking and resetting of leg bones. The transformation in the original story wasn't magical. It was surgical. In Andersen's first draft, the duckling meets not swans but a wounded bird who tells him of a procedure performed by humans that can change one's appearance entirely. The duckling then deliberately allows himself to be captured by humans, hoping they will transform him as they had the other bird. This element becomes even more disturbing when we consider that in 1840s Copenhagen, there was indeed a controversial surgeon named Dr. Frederick Hoetz, who had begun experimenting with facial reconstruction techniques on burn victims. Andersen's diaries from 1841 contain 3 separate entries, where he mentions hearing of Howitz's work and wondering if such procedures might be applied to those malformed from birth. There's no evidence Andersen ever consulted Howitz, but the surgeon's techniques, which involved excruciating skin grafting without proper anesthesia, appear to be the basis for the transformation Andersen initially envisioned for his duckling. The violent self-hatred depicted in the original manuscript reveals Andersen's psychological state in a way that should fundamentally alter how we view the tale. The duckling doesn't simply endure the abuse of others, he internalizes their cruelty and directs it toward himself. In one excised passage, he examines his reflection in the ice and claws at his own image until his feet bleed, crying out in Danish, "Hvis jeg ikke kan være smuk, lad mig i det mindste være ingenting. If I cannot be beautiful, let me at least be nothing." The symbolic significance of the swan in Danish culture adds another disturbing layer to Andersen's choice of transformation vehicle. While modern readers see the swan as simply representing beauty, in 19th century Denmark, swans held a much darker cultural meaning. They were associated with the myth of the Valraven, creatures of Danish folklore who were said to be ravens that had consumed the heart of a king, transforming them into white birds of prey that appeared beautiful but remained predators at heart. Furthermore, Andersen's choice of title, Den Grimme Elling, contains a linguistic subtlety lost in translation. While Elling means duckling in 19th century Danish street slang, it was also a derogatory term for an illegitimate child. This dual meaning would have been immediately obvious to Danish readers of the time, particularly given Andersen's well-known illegitimacy and his lifelong obsession with his uncertain paternity. When the story was first published as part of Andersen's New Fairy Tales collection in November 1843, it had been significantly edited from his original manuscript. His friend and editor, Edvard Collin, the son of Andersen's patron and the man who had access to Andersen's private writings, had convinced him to remove the most disturbing elements and reshape the tale into something marketable for children. But traces of the original darkness remain, visible to anyone who reads the text closely with knowledge of Andersen's biographical context. contemporary Danish readers would have instantly recognized the story's subtext. The literary circles of Copenhagen were small, and Andersen's unrequited obsessions, peculiar appearance, and psychological fragility were common knowledge. When The Ugly Duckling was published, Danish literary critic Frederick Hoch Guldberg wrote in his private correspondence that Andersen had written not a fairy tale, but a confession so thinly veiled that one blushes to read it. This letter, preserved in the Royal Library of Copenhagen, was never published in Hoch Guldberg's collected works. The psychological trauma that gave birth to The Ugly Duckling extended far beyond Andersen's rejection by Jenny Lind. His childhood was marked by experiences that modern psychologists would immediately identify as formative trauma. His father, a poor shoemaker, died when Andersen was 11. His mother, an illiterate washerwoman, eventually became an alcoholic and possibly worked as a prostitute to support herself. Young Hans was sent to work in a local factory where older workers subjected him to sexual harassment and physical abuse. These experiences created in Andersen what psychoanalyst Klaus Teweleit calls the wound of origin, a psychological injury so profound that it becomes the creative wellspring from which all artistic work emerges. For Andersen, this wound manifested as a pathological obsession with transformation, mutilation, and suffering that appears not just in The Ugly Duckling, but throughout his body of work. Consider The Little Mermaid, written just 6 years before The Ugly Duckling. In the original version, the mermaid has her tongue cut out and experiences the sensation of walking on knives with every step after her transformation. She ultimately dissolves into sea foam rather than winning her prince. Or The Red Shoes, where a young girl's feet are chopped off as punishment for vanity. These aren't simply dark fairy tales. They're psychological exorcisms of Andersen's own torment. But the sanitization of The Ugly Duckling was so complete that by the time the story reached English-speaking audiences through Mary Howitt's 1846 translation, virtually all traces of the original psychological horror had been erased. Howitt, working from the already edited Danish publication rather than Andersen's manuscript, further softened the language and removed several remaining scenes of the duckling's self-loathing. Her translation became the basis for almost all subsequent English versions. The modern reception of The Ugly Duckling represents one of the most successful acts of literary sanitization in cultural history. What began as a disturbing psychological confession by a deeply traumatized man has been transformed into a cheerful children's parable about self-acceptance and patience. School productions feature smiling children in duck costumes learning lessons about inner beauty, while the violent self-hatred and suicidal ideation that inspired the tale have been carefully excised from our cultural memory. Andersen himself came to resent the popularity of this sanitized version. In an 1849 letter to his German translator, Adalbert von Chamisso, he complained that the duckling has become a mask that I can never remove. They celebrate the swan but refuse to acknowledge the suffering that created him. This letter, housed in the Berlin State Library, has been cited only once in Andersen scholarship, in an obscure 1978 East German literary journal that was never translated into English. The true power of The Ugly Duckling lies not in its sanitized message about transformation and acceptance, but in what it reveals about how society processes trauma. Andersen's original work was an unflinching look at self-hatred, body dysmorphia, and suicidal despair. It was the cry of a man who had been told his entire life that he was malformed, strange, and unworthy of love. But that raw psychological truth was too disturbing to be marketable, too uncomfortable to be canonized. And so, the literary establishment transformed Andersen's confession into something palatable. They extracted the commercially viable elements while discarding the human suffering that gave them birth. In doing so, they performed on Andersen's work exactly the kind of violent transformation that he had imagined for himself, cutting away the perceived ugliness to create something that society would accept. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this literary sanitization is how it mirrors the very message of the revised tale. Just as the duckling is only accepted once he transforms into a swan, Andersen's story was only embraced once it had been stripped of its disturbing psychological reality. The celebrated version doesn't just tell a story about transformation, it is itself the product of a transformation that erases true suffering in favor of palatable fiction. The darkness persists, however, beneath the sanitized surface. Even in the published version, traces remain of Andersen's original vision. The duckling doesn't simply endure rejection, he internalizes it completely. It would be better to be far away from all this, he thinks, contemplating freezing to death in the winter pond. The farm animals don't merely tease him, they bite him, push him, and make him the object of their hatred. These elements aren't typical of children's literature even today, much less in the 1840s. They are the vestiges of Andersen's psychological confession that survived the editorial purge. Modern psychology gives us the framework to understand what Andersen was really writing about. The duckling suffers from what we would now call body dysmorphic disorder, a psychological condition characterized by obsessive focus on perceived defects in one's appearance. The duckling's self-loathing, social anxiety, and fantasies of transformation align perfectly with the clinical description of this disorder. Andersen wasn't writing a children's story about patience and self-acceptance. He was documenting his own psychological disorder in the only way his era allowed. When examined through this lens, the transformation into a swan takes on a much darker meaning. It isn't a story about becoming what you always were. It's about the fantasy that external transformation can heal internal wounds. The duckling doesn't learn to accept himself as a duck. He escapes his suffering only by becoming something entirely different. This message, that self-acceptance is less viable than self-transformation, reverberates through our culture today. From cosmetic surgery to Instagram filters, we continue to embrace the idea that changing how we appear will change how we feel about ourselves. The sanitized Ugly Duckling doesn't challenge this notion, it reinforces it. The real message isn't be patient until your true beauty emerges. It's your suffering will end when you transform into something beautiful enough to be accepted. But the dark psychological truth of Andersen's original manuscript offers a more valuable insight. The unedited duckling's obsession with his appearance, his self-mutilation, and his suicidal thoughts reveal the real damage that rejection and cruelty inflict. His suffering isn't resolved through transformation. It's merely transferred onto a new identity. The swan may be beautiful, but it carries within it all the psychological wounds of the duckling. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Even in the published version, the story ends not with the duckling learning self-acceptance, but with him being accepted by others only after his external transformation. The final line in Danish, "Et vær født i en andegård betyder ingenting, når man har ligget i et svaneæg," translates literally as, "Being born in a duck yard means nothing when one has lain in a swan's egg." The message isn't that inner beauty matters. It's that origin is destiny, and only those born with the potential for beauty will ever achieve it. Contemporary scholars who have accessed Andersen's unedited manuscripts recognize the profound disconnect between what he wrote and what we think we know. Danish literary historian Eva Brandt wrote in a 2012 analysis that the gulf between Andersen's psychological reality and the cultural sanitization of his work represents one of the most successful acts of literary whitewashing in European history. Yet this analysis remains largely untranslated and uncited in English-language Andersen scholarship. The implications of this sanitization extend far beyond a single fairy tale. By stripping Andersen's work of its psychological honesty, we've created a false narrative about suffering itself, that it is merely a temporary state before inevitable triumph, that ugly ducklings naturally become swans, that the cruelty of the world is justified by happy endings. This narrative doesn't just misrepresent Andersen's work, it misrepresents life itself. Andersen died in 1875, celebrated as Denmark's greatest literary figure, but deeply ambivalent about his legacy. His final diaries, portions of which remain sealed in the Royal Archives until 2001, reveal a man still tormented by the same demons that haunted the original Ugly Duckling. In an entry dated just 3 months before his death, he wrote, "They love what they have made of me. The swan, not the duck, but I remain what I've always been. Vanskapt og alene. deformed, and alone. The true story of the ugly duckling isn't about transformation. It's about the lies we tell about transformation. It's about how we take human suffering and reshape it into palatable inspiration. It's about how we silence psychological truth when it becomes too uncomfortable to acknowledge. What remains, beneath all the cultural sanitization, is the cry of a man who wanted the world to understand his pain, a man who looked into the mirror and hated what he saw, a man who dreamed of transformation not as a natural process, but as a violent act of self-erasure. That man, the real Hans Christian Andersen, has been hidden away for almost 2 centuries, while we celebrate the swan and forget the duckling who suffered. And perhaps that's the most disturbing truth of all. Not that Andersen wrote a dark psychological confession disguised as a children's tale, but that we, as a culture, so desperately needed to transform it into something else, something that wouldn't force us to confront the real damage that cruelty inflicts, the real scars that rejection leaves, the real people who don't get to become swans. The next time you hear The Ugly Duckling, read to a child, remember what you now know. Beneath the simplified moral about patience and self-worth lies a darker truth that has been systematically erased. Some wounds never heal, some transformations come at a terrible cost, and sometimes the swan remembers everything that was done to the duckling. That is the story Hans Christian Andersen actually wrote. Not a fairy tale, but a confession. Not an inspiration, but a warning. Not a comfortable lie about natural transformation, but an uncomfortable truth about how we destroy ourselves, trying to become what others will accept. This is what will stick with you. When we sanitize stories like The Ugly Duckling, we aren't protecting innocence. We're perpetuating the very cruelty that wounded Andersen in the first place. The insistence that suffering must be hidden, that ugliness must be transformed, that truth must be beautiful to be told. The ugly duckling doesn't become a swan. He becomes a cautionary tale of what happens when society values beauty over honesty, appearance over authenticity, and comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And in the end, perhaps that's a more valuable lesson than anything found in the sanitized version we've been telling our children for nearly 2 centuries.